Welcome everyone, really delighted to have you here at the Ada Lovelace Institute to talk to Brett Scott and Marloes Nicholls about Brett's new book, Cloudmoney, Cash, Crypto, Cards and the War for All Wallets. That's in the slightly wrong order, but those are all the essential things in there. The plan for today is to mainly have a conversation between Marloes and Brett. But before we do that, we're going to start with a quick snap poll in which we ask you what your current views of the cashless society and the move towards it are. And then we're going to do the equivalent poll at the end of the session to gauge to what extent, if at all, we've managed to change your mind about anything as a result of the discussion we're about to have. So we're going to start with that snap poll, then we'll move on to the bulk of the session, which will be the discussion between Brett and Marloes, and which threatens to be really interesting. And then we're going to have some time for a Q&A for concluding that final poll to gauge the extent to which anyone's minds have changed. But before I hand over to Brett and Marloes, I just want to say a bit about why I think the ideas in Brett's work are so interesting, and critically, why they're interesting and relevant to an organisation like the Ada Lovelace Institute, which is a London-based research institute which concentrates on making data and AI work for people and society. Now, at Ada, we don't do anything directly at the moment on questions of cash and fintech, but we are an organisation who is very interested in exploring how existing power structures shape and form the form that technologies take, and shape if and how those technologies are deployed. And we're also very interested in how technologies themselves shape, disrupt, and entrench existing power structures. And I think one of the most sustained interrogations that we've done so far over the course of our existence as an organisation is a programme we're running called Rethinking Data, which is an attempt to articulate what's wrong with the current data economy and to set out a positive vision for it in the future. And one of the key things that has emerged from that project was around control over essential digital infrastructure. I think many of the questions posed in Cloudmoney about control over essential infrastructure of money in the context of increasing digitization are natural analogues to the ones which we're grappling here at the Ada Lovelace Institute. So to anyone interested in the ideas presented in Cloudmoney, which I imagine is the majority of you, given that you've signed up for this, I would really suggest taking a look at the final report of Rethinking Data when it comes out, which is likely to be in the autumn. It's a really fascinating exploration of how some of the dynamics we'll be talking about today play out in different domains, and particularly digital domains. But I know you didn't come here to listen to me talk about and give a bit of a plug for other Ada projects. You came to listen to Brett and Marloes. So without further delay, I'm going to hand over to them. Just a bit of introductions first, though. Marloes Nicholls is Head of Policy and Advocacy at the Finance Innovation Lab. And she's going to be interviewing Brett Scott, who is a financial campaigner, a monetary anthropologist, and a former broker. In addition to being the author of Cloudmoney, which we're going to be speaking about today, he is also the author of The Heretic's Guide to Global Finance, Hacking the Future of Money, and he publishes at Altered States of Monetary Consciousness. So over to you both.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Harry, and thanks to the Ada team for inviting me to be part of this conversation with Brett. I think, both Ada and the lab are looking to understand power dynamics and address injustices in two really important systems: data and tech, and finance. And as those systems entwine, it's really great to be joining forces. I also want to say thanks to everyone on the call, because I know it's in London in particular, it's a really sunny day, but I assure you this conversation is going to be worth blocking out some sunshine for an hour. So we're going to have a chat in a minute, Brett and I, but first let's do the poll that Harry just mentioned. We hope this will get you thinking about the things we're going to be discussing today, but also assess our conversation. So please answer this question. Are you comfortable with a future in which you can't use cash? Agree, disagree, or not sure? We're just going to keep that up for 20 seconds or so, and then we'll give you the results at the end of the call. So do please share your answer. And I understand it will be anonymous, so we don't know what you've said. All right, so I'll just, I think we'll keep that for another few seconds or so, and then if George, you let me know when the poll's done, we'll carry on with the conversation. All right, brilliant. So I've got loads of questions to ask Brett, but just to set the scene, I was thinking, Brett, about when we first met, which was about 10 years ago, and how much has changed in that period in terms of money and finance. I think, a decade ago, most transactions were made in cash. It was about 60%. You could pay with contactless on very small amounts. I don't think we'd had a conversation about Bitcoin at that point, at least I hadn't with you. And there were also really big, more invisible shifts that have happened since then. Because I think everyone's kind of used to some of the changes in payments, but more behind the scenes, I think we've become, increasingly reliant on these huge data centers that are, we rely on to manage all our online payments and look at our online banking and so on. We also have, banks able to kind of access more of our lives through apps that are on our phones, and they can see what our activity is on our phones. And another thing which I think is quite interesting is we looked at the meetings that the CEO of the Financial Conduct Regulator had last year, and most of his meetings were with Google, which is, a first. Our power holders in finance are meeting more with big tech leaders. So huge amount of changes. And I think in the mainstream, this is kind of celebrated as progress, as convenience. It's been promised to disrupt and improve the broken banking system, particularly post global financial crisis. And as you point out in your book as well, Brett, if you're not part of it, you're kind of considered as left behind, and that you should be part of this tech progress. But what your book does so well, and I really appreciate it, thank you for writing it, is encourage us to think more critically about this, to ask deeper questions about what's really going on here, what's the nature of the change, why is it happening, and who is it benefiting. And you really bring your experience as a journalist and with your anthropological practice to that. So thank you very much.
Glad you liked it. There's a lot of pain went into that book, but I hope something beautiful has come out of it.
Definitely. I think I shared on Twitter, it actually brought a tear to my eyes.
It brought many tears to my eye.
So before we go into some of the more kind of analysis, I wonder if you could share a bit more about how you approach looking at money and finance. And obviously you've got some anthropological training, and we have a bit of a joke at the lab of kind of like, you need to put your power goggles on if you're going to look at the finance system. I wonder if you could share,
Sure.
what tools and approaches you bring to your analysis. Thank you.
Yeah, well, actually, my first book, which came out in 2013, The Heretic's Guide to Global Finance, was kind of this punk anthropology type of approach to finance, where I was drawing on my own, essentially ethnographic experience of working in the financial sector. There is a branch within anthropology called upward anthropology, where you, rather than historically anthropologists would kind of do downward anthropology, where they would come from a position of power and then sort of enter a community that had less power. But they developed upward anthropology is the opposite of that, when you try to go into powerful institutions, whether it be the financial sector or the oil sector, or now probably big tech will be the place to be looking at. But upward anthropology is one great tradition. But then there's also a tradition in anthropology of sort of activist anthropology, anthropologists who will get involved in sort of political activism around, often because they get radicalized by communities they find themselves in. Actually, David Graeber, who's one of a great inspiration of mine, David Graeber is a very good example of an activist anthropologist. So a lot of my stuff has this kind of vibe to it where I actually worked in finance, I worked in high finance, I worked in the world of derivatives, but I've always had this kind of adventurous attempt or slightly subversive impulse to sort of experience these systems. And yeah, my first book that came out as The Heretic's Guide to Global Finance. That was about 2013. But in Cloudmoney, it's actually very similar. I'm taking lots of experience that I've had over the last 10 years of immersing myself in lots of different scenes, including, for example, the cryptocurrency scene, and bringing it to life. We're trying to sort of synthesize a lot of it as well. But yeah, anthropology is really good for this type of exploring human networks. And I mean, I could expand on this more if you would like me to.
Well, I guess it would be, I think for the audience, it'd be helpful, if you've got any kind of heuristics or what a question or a way you should approach looking at.
Sure. Maybe the one thing I'll say about the economic anthropology, which is really, really useful. It's quite hard to convey this in a simple way. But historically, economics has this very, very bad tendency of imagining that human beings are these solo individuals who then come together to form societies. And so there's this idea that individuals precede networks. Okay. And this is the whole of modern economics has this as a sort of implicit assumption within it. And actually the way economics understands monetary systems has the same underlying assumptions. A lot of the theories of money that come out of economics often assume that there are rational reasons for people to use money. There are these sort of solo individuals who need to find a way to trade, and it's inefficient if they don't have money. Therefore, they must invent money because they have to find this way to create these networks. And that's a very typical economics approach, and it inevitably ends up in the economists inventing the mythology of barter and commodity money and all this kind of stuff, which is very, very typical. Anthropology, by contrast, has this starting point where we assume that networks of people precede individuals, and individuals are never actually, they're almost constituted by other people around them. They can never be considered in a vacuum. And this changes the whole sort of way you see monetary systems often, but I mean economic systems more generally. So this idea that networks precede individuals rather than the other way around is very, very useful when you're trying to think about how we get caught up in these monetary systems and how they end up working. I hope that's not too obscure, but that's
super interesting. And I think there's a bit of a pattern of anthropologists actually helping us to understand financial systems, like Gillian Tett or David Graeber, like you've mentioned as well.
Absolutely,
so it's a really useful approach.
I mean, anybody who's interested in understanding monetary systems, it's advisable to look at economic anthropology, or at least starting with economic anthropology rather than economics, because economic anthropology is far broader in its approach, far more holistic.
Yeah, brilliant. Right, so let's get into the kind of topic of the book. I think one of the really important points that you make is that digital payments, we hear they give us convenience and ease and speed and stuff, but actually the real power that they give is to large corporates. So I wonder, just to start unpicking that a bit, could you say a bit more about what is a digital payment and what are the most important differences between that and cash?
Sure, yeah, there's like a simple way of saying this, and there's a far more complex way of saying this. Let me start with this simple way. Cash payments happen here and now, whereas digital payments happen elsewhere and later. All right, so cash transactions are essentially units. Cash is units of money issued by a state in physical form. And they have this inherent decentralization aspect to it. Cash actually has quite an interesting property. It comes from central institutions, a central bank, and yet ends up with a highly decentralized practice around it. Essentially, you have to move from person to person. It has to sort of travel the land from hand to hand. And when cash essentially has this thing that when you hand it over, the transaction is done. It's right there and then. It's here and now. Digital money, by contrast, involves sending messages to distant institutions, data centers, and asking those institutions to intermediate on your behalf. All right. And that will take place elsewhere, and they'll clear all the stuff later. All right. So this is one very, very basic component of where all the power dynamics come from, because as soon as you're relying on these centralized institutions to intermediate between you, of course, it brings in a whole bunch of implications. But one of the important things maybe to just sort of say about this is often people, when they're thinking about the monetary system, imagine there's a single type of monetary system. They just imagine, so for example, in the UK, the British pound. The British pound isn't actually a singular thing. The British pound ecosystem is made up of multiple forms of money. The one that we have as our primary sort of mental image is actually cash notes. You know, if you type into Google money, you'll see these notes there. And this is the state part of the monetary system. This is the kind of the core of the monetary system, units of money issued by state institutions. But there's a secondary part of the monetary system, which is issued by commercial banks. And these are these digital units. And in the book, I'm using this a metaphor of the casino. I don't know if you remember this metaphor, but I ask people to think of themselves walking into a casino and handing over cash to a cashier and then getting chips from the casino, which you can use internal to a casino. So casino chips are a type of secondary money issued to you that can be used within a private enclosure. And actually, digital money is quite similar to this. We see those units, for example, in your Barclays account, and you think it's the British pound, but really those are digital chips issued out to you by Barclays, which can be used within the Barclays enclosure. And the whole digital money system essentially is about how you coordinate the movement of these chips around the banking system. And once people kind of understand that, you start to intuit the politics of this, the surveillance implications, the power to the banking sector, and so on.
Mm. Yeah, I think that's really helpful how you distinguish between those different layers. And so you've got physical state money broadly, then the digital bank chips. And there's also a third layer, which is this kind of PayPal type layer of money as well.
Exactly. Groups like PayPal that will take your bank chips and issue a third tier chip. You know, but it's one, I don't want to get too much into the nitty-gritty of this, but, you know, in the past, actually, you would have, for example, banks issuing their own banknotes, which would be an example of a sort of second tier form of money issued in physical form. But the distinction nowadays is the first tier money is issued in physical form, at least a part of it, and then the second tier is in digital form. So when we talk about digital money, and at least mainstream digital money, we're talking about bank issued digital chips. And that's what the cashless society is. So cashless society is a euphemism. It's referring to sort of, it draws attention away by pointing to what is absent. What is really there is the banking sector, right? So it's far harder to market the bank chip society than the cashless society there.
We're going to try and unmarket it. And I guess, so if we're using these digital bank chips, the more we use them, the more of a trail we leave behind us, like a digital trail. And I think you say in the book that someone's measured it, and like HSBC has the equivalent of like hundreds of thousands of warehouses full of data about us that's based on these data trails from digital payments and so on. Yeah. And so could you say a bit about like how this benefits those firms? How does this give them more power, having access to that data?
Well, I think it's actually an open question. I mean, Ada Lovelace is working on, AI and stuff. And one of the big impulses behind AI is, how on earth do you make sense of vast amounts of data? Human beings really struggle, so that in the book, I develop a metaphor of, if you're imagining that your computer is a warehouse and you're trying to stack things in it and you're slowly filling this warehouse up, HSBC has, like 153,000 warehouses worth of information stacked to the brim. Anyway, there's a lot of information that they have, right? But human bankers actually don't really know how to act upon that data. And so a lot of the impulse behind essentially the automation of analysis, which is, AI as a kind of thing that tries to do that, comes from, banks trying to make sense of this data. But one of the sort of big, in this day and age, data is a massive prize, and payments data is incredibly sensitive. I mean, there's this phrase, put your money where your mouth is, because your payments really show you where your priorities lie, or really show somebody else where your priorities lie. So payments data is a massive frontier. And of course, cash transactions leave no data trail. So there's a vast data left off the table, as it were. So there's a massive data element to this, which is why, this book is actually partly, at least an element of it, falls into this broader field of books which are now analyzing surveillance capitalism more generally. But this is, I'm honing in on sort of the financial side of that.
Yeah. And something I find quite interesting is that, for a long time, one of the problems with financial services is that we know that it's benefited from what economists call an information asymmetry. Like, banks always have more expertise and information than their clients. And so you'd think access to more data would be a massive red flag. But actually, it seems to be kind of celebrated by policymakers as a way that might just somehow disrupt. Of
course, yeah. But this is a general. I used to work as a broker in the financial sector and in high finance, and as a broker, you're basically trying to find out secret information about what all the different players are doing, and you're trying to slowly filter it around to induce action. And many of these, when you're in the realm of big institutions, it's hard to find data on them. But there's this double standard where they expect that data about sort of their small scale clients should be readily available. So there's an information asymmetry where large institutions can cloak themselves in confidentiality laws, but they expect everyone else to not have those. And actually, one of the things I say in the book, which is, I think I mentioned this thing where, banks expect to be able to access all your payments data when deciding whether to give you a loan, but you can't access their loan history when deciding if you want to actually accept a loan from them. All right, so there's this very
one-way looking glass, I think.
Exactly, and but this is a general feature of large-scale institutions.
Yeah. And you mentioned there that it's a bit of an open question. How are banks or other firms going to use all this data on our payments to their benefit? I think this is where potentially fintech and to some extent big tech comes in. So fintech being kind of the use of tech in finance, but also new startups that have got like new ways of analyzing data or making decisions off the back of them. And as I mentioned earlier, this was really like celebrated as a potential disruptive force that was going to break open the banking oligopoly, or I think that it was found that 90% of people were paying over the odds for their current account because of a lack of competition in finance, and fintech was seen as this way to challenge that. What do you think fintech has been a disruptive force for good, or I get the sense in your book that it's kind of actually become more of a kind of essential ingredient for this merger between big tech and big finance?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I don't know who remembers in 2008, Google was still considered a non-evil company. Actually, big tech in general had this whole kind of like glow about it back in 2008. People still thought there were sort of these like fun, cuddly companies. And then fast forward 10 years, that's of course changed. Now they have far more power than actually many financial institutions do. They certainly have much higher market capitalization. They have, it was always big oil and big finance were the top of the stock market originally. Now they've all been displaced by big tech, and that's been a phenomenon that's happened in the last 10 years. But how this intersects with fintech is back in 2008 during the financial crisis. And I remember I was working as a broker during the financial crisis. The fintech companies were essentially these companies that were importing Silicon Valley style aesthetics and sort of interfaces into finance. But part of their marketing strategy was that they were this kind of democratization force. And at a time when banks were under a lot of public, there was reviled actually. This marketing pitch had a lot of resonance with the public. Had these tech companies would come in and sort of revamp finance and revolutionize finance, and all the original fintech companies were all about revolutionizing, etc. Really what's been going on though is that, the way I look at fintech is, I've been around that scene for a while, is essentially it specializes in just automating finance. And if you look at the history of global capitalism, there's always, these phases that happen in the capitalist systems. And, fine, maybe an old sort of like stodgy bank at some point is resistant to automation because they have a certain power base already. But it's not like somehow the power of big finance declines when it gets automated and expanded. All right. So a lot of fintech companies have been specializing in doing that. They've sort of been specializing in actually front running the pre-existing automation tendencies within big financial institutions. Bear in mind that banks, they're large institutions. They spend a lot of time doing things like, financing, Russian oil deals and stuff like that. There's only a certain amount of their resources that they can put towards automating themselves. Whereas if you're a 10-person startup that only does tech, you can actually focus all your attention on creating these types of digital interfaces. And what's sort of been happening in the fintech world is that they originally were faster than the banks at providing these automation technologies, but they've basically slowly been absorbed into the banking sector as banks find it useful to absorb them, because in the end, banks benefit when they automate because they can reach more people. And really, that's what the end story of fintech is. There's been some slight rearrangement of power at some level, but really it's extending the power of big finance, whilst maybe changing its surface appearance, perhaps.
Yeah, you talk in the book about this kind of reskinning of finance.
Yeah, but think about your old school finance. Your original bankers specialized in assessing credit worthiness and things like that. They weren't necessarily specialists in slick aesthetics. All right, your bank branch was a kind of, you can think of it as an interface into finance, but that was the kind of interface. Whereas Silicon Valley interfaces were basically specialized, in having them on digital devices that port you directly into these institutions, right? Yeah. And so a lot of these fintech companies basically started out as interfaces that would plug into the banking sector. And they would sort of start out as interfaces, and then maybe later they would kind of try to get a banking license and actually become a real bank. But a lot of them were really about sort of pasting layers over the existing financial sector.
Absolutely. And, frustratingly also often distancing us from the human side of finance as well. It's very hard I have bank with the co-op, there is no branch now in my city. And you just, it's very, well, I guess this I want to move a bit on to some of the examples of why what we've just talked about, what we've described, why that can have negative impacts. I think a lot of people feel very frustrated with their access to financial services now because it's so automated. You need to remember all these passwords and, feel like it's safe and online and so on. But I wonder if you could pull out a few examples that you give in your book of what are some of the social and environmental risks of this, digitization?
Sure. Well, bear in mind, one of the arguments I'm making in the book kind of has three sort of sections to it. The first section is looking at the monetary system and the war on cash, which is the various top-down pushes against the cash system. All right. And I'm basically countering the narrative that the decline in the cash system comes from the bottom up as some sort of spontaneous upwelling from ordinary people, right? I'm sort of rebalancing that narrative in the first part of the book. In the second part, with the sort of fintech stuff, I'm looking at how the digitization of money via the war on cash is a necessary element of how you automate finance more generally. right? Which is what the fintech sector specializes in. And that in turn is basically what enables big tech and big finance companies to fuse. So one of the big trends over the last 10 years has been the fusion between large-scale digital corporations and large-scale financial corporations. For Amazon to operate across the world, it has to have digital money infrastructures. It can't operate with cash. It's totally anathema to the operations of large-scale digital tech companies. And then the third part, I go into some of these sort of the crypto sort of counter, well, at least the attempted counter revolution, or the troubled revolution, shall we say. But yes, in terms of the sort of the first element of that, which is looking at the decline of the cash system, well, there's massive implications in terms of, for a start, we've already mentioned the stuff around surveillance. The easiest way to know about this is to enter a country where there's authoritarian tendencies. People automatically know this problem. You don't need to explain to people that this is an issue. If you speak to, for example, anybody from, I was speaking to an Iranian the other day, and he was saying, yes, this is well known, right? That this is a severe problem. So the surveillance element's a big problem. With surveillance comes the potential for censorship, which is the use of payment systems to restrict people's behavior, or to try and steer people's behavior in various ways. And actually that can take corporate forms as well as state forms. The other actually big thing which I'm drawing out in the book is the resilience problems. There's, in our existing monetary system, there's a balance, it's increasingly unbalanced, but between a physical state form of money and a private digital form of money. But as that physical state money system goes down, you have a very unresilient system. And I can go into that if you would like me to, but one of the big sort of meta problems in places like the UK is that the banking sector already is too big to fail. And now we're forcing people to essentially have to have bank accounts at these too big to fail institutions that already have huge political power. So as you walk around London and you see everybody increasingly sucked into this vortex of contactless payment, as they kind of slump into that situation, it's very, very simple to see how much power is being transferred to the banking sector in that process. But yeah, there's many.
I thought there were some interesting examples during the pandemic of the use of like digital identities or credit scores to access. Initially, it was to access COVID tests, and also as an initial screening before you access NHS hospitals. And that brings with it all sorts of biases, because your credit score, we know that people on low incomes have worse credit scores, for example. So you're more likely to be screened to access NHS services than if you're on low income. And, that's really unjust. And yeah, interesting that you mentioned resilience as well. And I think Sweden, where they've gone kind of more cashless than us in the UK, some of the pushback there has come from this realization that actually, oh my goodness, if we had an earthquake or something, like, well, Sweden's actually advised its citizens that they keep cash in case Russia invades. Right. That was, they issued that advice a couple of years ago. But the problem is that a lot of these central banks have a very problematic position in an economy, is that they half represent the state and they half represent the banking sector. They're essentially a type of institution lodged between the state and the banking sector. They issue state money in the form of cash, but they also are supposed to keep the stability of the banking sector, which is these private institutions. So it's sort of stuck in this position. And central banks will always say, we're neutral on cash. We don't want to promote it. But of course, their banking members, for example, in the UK, the Barclays, HSBC, all these players are the ones that compete against cash with their digital chips. All right, so central banks should be promoting the cash system, but they try to pretend that it's a neutral act to not promote it, because they're basically letting the banking sector take over, and then it's causing problems for them, because now the resilience of the monetary system declines, and then they get stuck in this position where they don't want to upset their banking partners, but they also find themselves
very concerned about the resilience of their systems. I mean, even stuff like cyber attacks. You're suddenly dependent on digital money systems, and cyber attacks happen. I mean, this is a real problem.
Yeah. Another risk, which I feel like it's sort of just emerging, is control and manipulation. And I was really struck, I hadn't read The Handmaid's Tale before, but you've got an excerpt in the book about CompuBank and how, that has been, I've just seen the TV series, but, the idea is there in the book. And I think I've seen a speech before where the Bank of England talk about, you could actually affect whether people can buy cigarettes or not, with a central bank digital currency. Or I wonder if you could say a bit more about whether you think digital payments could lead to social coercion in this way.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, this is an obvious risk, and of course right now it doesn't present itself as a huge risk because we still have the buffer of the cash system. We haven't actually ever experienced a situation where you don't have that buffer, but in some future scenario you can certainly see the potentiality of that. Even people have been talking a lot about central bank digital currency now, which is essentially the situation where a state institution like a central bank issues its own form of digital currency. People have been thinking that's some sort of unique surveillance risk, but the banking sector already poses a massive surveillance risk. And so states already have access to what the banks, the data they collect and so on. But actually welfare recipients have historically been the people that gets this type of stuff gets tested on. I mean, a good example is the Australian cashless welfare card, which is a digital money system which is handed out with prepaid cards to welfare recipients in Australia, which basically prevents them from buying certain things from certain retailers, right? And also stops them drawing out cash in order to bypass those rules. So it's a highly paternalistic system. And it's essentially forcing people to spend money in certain kind of ways. And actually, one of the interesting critiques made of things like that, which is something I bring up in the book, which is a big hidden aspect of this problem, is how digital money is an attack on localization. Libertarians and so on are very concerned about the surveillance panopticon type element, but it's often missed that actually, if you want to facilitate large-scale corporate centralization, you have to have digital money systems. Think about Amazon. It cannot operate with this sort of money that moves from person to person. These corporate conglomerations operate through the intersection of big data centers that talk to each other, right? It can't have millions of people doing the interactions. It has to have everyone going through these systems. And that requires digital money. So if you think about the core experiential difference between, say, a 1950s economy and our economy right now, is a lot of a 1950s style economy would involve people walking to local stores with cash, all right? And you interact with this local storekeeper. Perhaps that local storekeeper has a connection to some centralized corporation somewhere where they're getting the goods from, but there's always this decentralized aspect. Whereas nowadays, what's happening is increasingly we're routing essentially smartphone messages to giant data centers to mediate all these interactions. So corporate centralization is completely dependent on digital money.
Yeah, and so I've been trying to use cash more. And I imagine some people on this call have been doing that too, or might do after this. And it's
hard in London.
I live in Oxford. I thought about coming to London. I was like, actually, I'm having a day off from it because it's just too hard. If I'm, going to go on the tube and things, that's really challenging. And I wonder if, what power do you think the use of cash could give us, and what are the limits of that power?
Yeah, I have quite a strong existentialist sort of streak in me. I have different political stripes, but at some level, I'm simply interested at one level if we are able to assert the fact that human beings are small-scale physical beings, all right, rather than how do I put this? I basically have the sense that at the core of global capitalism is something slightly inhuman, All right. This idea that somehow what we desire is ever more speed and large scale interconnection and quote unquote convenience isn't really something that actual human beings really resonate with when push comes to shove. When push comes to shove, human beings resonate with immediacy, like texture, touch, this kind of stuff, you know? And that's what you come back to. And I feel at the core of our economic systems is they frequently are asking us to do something that is essentially at some level inhuman. All right. And there's something interesting about trying to assert your right to use cash. You can feel the futility at some level. If you go into London, you can feel the entire economic network recalibrating around you as it basically makes itself more amenable to corporate capitalism. All right. You can feel that process in your body. And if you try to use cash, you can feel yourself going against it. Going to Sweden is even more intense, right? This whole sort of network is actually rejecting you. So I think there's an interesting kind of, performance you can try. So they say, are you actually able to withstand these forces of global corporate capitalism? So at some level, that's one thing I'm arguing. But I think at a more practical level, beyond the sort of existentialist impulse, there is a real concern actually among large-scale institutions, state institutions, that if we do go along the lines of the sort of corporate capitalist impulse, we're going to be really screwed. There's going to be severe problems will emerge in normal capitalism. I hope that wasn't too obscure. Sorry, that was a bit of a...
No, that's great. And I think as well as trying to use cash, it's like, if you can't, just have a conversation with someone about it, or like let someone in a shop know that you're interested in using cash, and like that's proved really interesting as well. Just like what that
you
generates.
need to talk to the bosses though. The problem is that
you're not blaming anyone, but just to
I think I'm very keen to start building these movements because, you know, as I was saying, the digital tech or digital finance companies, Visa, MasterCard, have spent a long time doing this top-down push against cash. I don't know if you remember in 2016, Visa launched its Cash Free and Proud campaign in London. And one of their stated aims was to make cash feel peculiar by 2020. Visa has been notorious in how it's tried to demonize cash in the public imagination for a long, long time. And they've succeeded. All right. They've very skillfully succeeded in it. And I think there needs to be a counter push. There needs to be citizen movements that push back and say, actually, we're not just... And I really hate this narrative, which frames people who still use cash as sort of being these kind of, you know, poor, kind of like slow people who kind of need to, you know, give them some time and they'll eventually upgrade to the digital money system. You know, this is the left behind narrative, which is often very popular in the public domain, where, you know, you'll have these sort of well-meaning institutions that say, well, you know, give the elderly people some time to upgrade and, you know, let's go slower. I go against it. I say we need to actively promote the cash system as being better than digital money, which is why I often call cash the bicycle of payments, because that's kind of what it is. And bicycles are great.
I love my bike. I'm just looking at the time. I can't believe we've gone over. Well, that's kind of brought us to an end, but I think that's a brilliant place to close. And now we would love to hear your questions as well. So do have a think about that and write them in the Q&A function. Oh, I can see we've got a couple already. So I will just read those out. Oh, we've got a comment from Will who says that a tube ticket was actually cheaper if he paid with contactless. So I think, you know, we're seeing more incentives, aren't we, like this, to try and get people into the digital payments system. And then a question from Andy. How do we respond when we are told by our friends that we don't need to worry about surveillance and coercion aspects, as we are in a free Western democracy? What would you say, Brett?
Yeah, well, I mean, this is a big element of this dynamic. Is, you know, as I was mentioning, there's a direct correlation between levels of trust in institutions and levels of cash usage. Sweden has very high cash, very high digital money usage, precisely because there's such high public trust in large-scale institutions. I don't know if you guys have spent time in Sweden, but maybe I'm sort of essentializing it a bit here, but people are sort of, the idea that somehow institutions would act against you is quite alien. People have this sort of sense, it's like, well, obviously the big institution will act on my behalf, So it's got this quite interesting feel to it, that people find it sort of slightly absurd that you would not have a natural resonance towards big institutions. But as soon as you leave a context like that and go to, a place, for example, even like Greece or Turkey or South Africa, where I'm from, this intuition that institutions work for your best interest is simply not found. It's just not there. All right. Yeah. People have an inherent distrust of institutions often. And actually, there's a very, very strong correlation between cash usage and distrust in banking institutions, precisely because the cash system doesn't rely upon you having to have a bank account or to sort of submit yourself to these institutions. But in the UK, there is this, and in the UK, people have long been abused by the banking sector. But I would agree that actually there's quite a low level of resistance in the UK. I've been for many years wondering why that is, why it is in UK society that these big institutions can often get away with so much without facing any real repercussions. But certainly there's a sort of slightly numb sense in the UK that somehow these institutions would never act against you, even though, for example, in the 2008 financial crisis, it's been long proven that the banking sector, which runs the entire digital money system, frequently acts against people's interests all the time. All right. But in terms of, say, government abuse of the digital payment systems, people have a sense that in the UK that the government's beyond that kind of thing. It's, democracy and so on. But this is not guaranteed. This is not something is guaranteed to stay. I mean, the reason why The Handmaid's Tale is used as a sort of dystopian warning tale is precisely that in The Handmaid's Tale, there's a sort of this extreme government that comes to power and uses a digital money system to essentially disempower women and control their lives. This idea of keeping the cash system, which is a public money system, as a buffer or a sort of guarantee against that possibility is very, very important. And it's a public utility.
Brilliant. Thank you. I can see questions coming in thick and fast now. So we're going to try and let's try and get through a few of them. Also, just to remind you, we've got a second poll at the end, and then we'll give you all the answers to the poll. So we've got a question about cashless and inequality. And someone has asked about how going cashless can reinforce power structures by disempowering people who can't participate in cashless. For example, they might be homeless or not have a bank account. I think we've talked a bit, Brett, about how digital payments can actually reinforce inequalities. Do you also think there are things that we've missed that we've talked about?
Yeah, I mean, look, the book goes much deeper into this. I mean, we haven't had much time to go into it here, but I mean, if you're a lefty, I mean, the war against cash is a class war, like straight out. It's a class war, and you can easily see this if you see which institutions go, quote unquote, go cashless first. There always are these sort of bougie upper income type places where people have high trust in the banking sector and also good credit ratings and so on, which they feel is sort of obvious and that you want to move, and it's aspirational. You say, well, we're going to take on these large corporate systems rather than the sort of slow physical system. As soon as you move out of that context, though, you go to say more working class communities in the UK, cash usage spikes way up. All right. The thing is, though, those voices are never heard. All right, because that impulse, which is to hold on to some sort of localized, sort of smaller scale type of system, goes against the grain of what's happening in global capitalism, which is towards corporate centralization and ever larger markets. So those voices don't get heard, right? There's an agreed upon trajectory in innovation, which is eventually cash will have to go and we will all be digital, right? That's the sort of standard innovation narrative you'll find. And that's an ideological position, because that basically is saying will agree to let the banking sector and big tech take over. All right. Now, that is not that's not an apolitical position. That's a position that's handing a lot of power to big corporations. All right. And this idea that somehow that's in the interests of people in the lowest rungs of society is a very twisted idea. All right. So a big part of the pushback on the cash system is to say, look, it's not just people who are sort of slow, who have, yet to be brought in, who use it. It's often people who don't feel that they actually want to be brought into those institutions, and we should be protecting a public alternative. The cash system is the only public money system we have. Those digital chips are a private system. So rather than, the state, for example, trying to help to onboard people into Barclays, which is often what it tries to do, they'll go and hand out card readers to, the big issue sellers and things like that. They should be protecting the cash system and asserting that it's important to have a public money system. But yeah, there's a huge class element to this. I hope I sort of answered that question properly.
Yeah, and as you say, there is lots in the book about this as well. We've got a few questions here which are about, whether it's possible to mimic some of the merits of cash, like physical cash, within digital payments. So, is the physical nature of cash really important, or might we be able to kind of think about a different digital system that would be a better alternative?
Well, look, my existentialist side says the physicality is important, but let's say it's very, very hard for my existentialist sort of, side to, if I went up in Parliament and said, human beings desire physicality and texture, they're going to look at me like I'm some ridiculous lunatic, right? But yes, if I was to argue in sort of more pragmatic political lines, it is possible to form certain types of more anonymous forms of digital money. And look, we haven't really touched on crypto that much, but the whole history of crypto is cryptocurrencies has been about this. And in the 1990s, people like David Chaum, who's one of the original cypherpunks, which is the sort of movement that were looking forward and seeing like, hey, in a future cashless society, we're going to be in a real problematic situation. There's going to be huge amounts of corporate and state centralization. We need to form an alternative type of quote unquote digital cash. And a lot of the innovations that were developed by people like David Chaum and others came together in 2008 to form the Bitcoin system. So all these components that have been developed earlier sort of came together in a recipe, which is the Bitcoin system. And the original Bitcoin system is claimed to be a type of digital cash. And the main thing I'll say right now is, I've worked on Bitcoin for a long time, and I have a lot of critiques of Bitcoin as well. But the one thing I would say about crypto tokens is that they are actually a very interesting hybrid form. All right. In the traditional distinction in monetary systems is cash is a bearer instrument. It means whoever's holding it controls it. Whereas, the money that you're using with your contactless card is a type of ledger system, which is dependent on these large institutions. You ask them to do something on your behalf. Crypto actually blends these two concepts together. It is actually a ledger system, but it cannot work unless you directly initiate the payments yourself. So it has this interesting quasi-digital ledger, so digital hybrid digital bearer instrument structure. Now that becomes quite interesting if you're thinking about how you build a type of digital cash. And for example, things like stable coins have some of that vibe to them. They have a bit more of this digital cash type of vibe to them. So that is definitely an interesting area.
Yeah, and I think, the history of Bitcoin in your book, it gave me a lot of empathy for that movement. And, although there's a bit of a mess going on, massive, I think some of the contradictions you pull out in that movement almost create cracks and kind of seeds of hope for, future better alternatives for imagining.
Yeah, and I mean the the crypto world is a kind of like, you know, a sort of real shit show sometimes. Like, but and I would say though it has created a hotbed of activity, which a lot of interesting stuff can emerge out of it. All right, a lot of that creativity has been stared down extremely toxic and sort of wasteful avenues. But at the same time, there have been learnings that have been happening, lots of sort of interesting developments. So I think the next 5 years will probably be quite an interesting time to see what happens in that space. And potentially some interesting stuff could come out, especially when we start to look at, maybe it's something I can sort of kind of close on, is when you move away, Bitcoin has this problem where it sort of fixates on this idea of creating some kind of digital commodity, and it draws on lots of conservative thinking about money. But when you actually take some of the crypto technology and you hybridize it with some of this more interesting anthropological ideas of money as a sort of credit system, you can come up with some quite interesting stuff. And lots of the most innovative alternative monetary thinkers right now are trying to do that. Taking, for example, mutual credit systems and sort of thinking about how you hybridize them with digital structures.
Yeah, and we've got mutual credit projects here in the UK as well.
Yeah, sure.
We're gonna have to wrap up. I can't believe it. It's flown by. We would love to run the poll again. So I think that's just gonna jump up on your screen. Do stay and share your answer to that, and then we'll share the results. So we'll just leave that up for 15 seconds or so. And then I wonder, Harry, do you want to come back and share the results and wrap up? Or I can.
I'm attempting to start my video, but I seem to be audible, and that is all we need for this. Very happy to come back in. We're just finishing up with the poll, but I can reveal that the poll we took at the beginning, I can reveal the results to that. So the question, as you know, is I am comfortable with a future in which I can't use cash. 10% of people agreed, 63% of people disagreed, and 27% of people weren't sure. So that was the results at the beginning. And I'm just awaiting the results for the poll that we're just doing. And that was also with 95% participation. Oh, that's on the second poll, so that should be good. So just awaiting the results for the second one now.
It's like a test.
So we've got that in, and that's visible on your screen. So 0% of people now agree with the proposition. We've got 87% of people disagreeing and 13% not sure. So it looks like you've both been pretty convincing, or you've been pretty convincing, Brett. So that's really, really interesting.
Good.
Fantastic. Go and buy Brett's book and buy a copy for your friends as well.
Yeah, and I think it's important to have conversations about this with people, because I think it's really something that really isn't spoken about enough.
Yeah.
Great. Well, I think we can safely bring the events to a close in that case. All that remains for me to do is to thank you all in the audience for joining us for what's proven to be a really, really fascinating and worthwhile conversation. And thank you so much both to Marloes and to Brett. And yeah, reiterate, go and get a copy of Brett's book and brandish a tenner or several tenors at your local book retailer as opposed to buying with card.
Yeah, lots of the Waterstones have them, but if your local bookseller doesn't, ask them to order it.
Absolutely. Well, thank you both so much. And thank you everyone in the audience.
Thanks everyone.
Thanks so much. Thanks, Marloes. Thanks, Harry.
Thanks.